Okay, continuing with chapter 2, and this is question 4 again on your syllabus. Indicate the similarities and differences among the southern colonies of Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Georgia. So you'll have a map to look at that you'll have to complete over all of the colonies. Okay, so if we go to page 32, VA is Virginia. Virginia grew completely dependent upon the growth of tobacco. This was a poor man's crop. You could start it pretty easily. And I've read books where they talk about it was growing out on the front patio and the front yard. You just grew it anywhere you could. The effects of tobacco, okay, again, we're looking at how all of these were similar. Very labor intensive. The first Indians were there to do the labor, then Africans. 1619 was the first slave ship. To be profitable, tobacco farmers needed a lot of land. They pushed into territory upriver. The plantations that developed in all of these colonies were very spread out. No urban class developed. A very aristocratic, meaning you're born into certain classes, so to speak. You know, that's what you were born into. No public school, few churches, and you'll need to know this. You're going to start a comparison between these colonies and New England colonies because it's ultimately all going to lead to the Civil War. So this is one of the ways that they were similar. And a lot of them grow some kind of crop like tobacco, rice, indigo, sugar, and eventually cotton. They all had a one-crop economy that led to no other manufacturing for the most part or interest in industry of any kind. And again, this is all going to be very evident by the Civil War because if you could buy the slaves, if you could buy the crop and get it started, that's where your money was made. So they had no reason to invest in industry, which that'll all come later anyway. All right, the West Indies, if you look on page 36, and they are, I believe I may have shown these. This is like Cuba, Dominican Republic, Haiti, all of those islands in the Caribbean. They're the Sugar Islands, and their impact on South Carolina, I always think is very interesting. The Sugar Islands had one crop, sugar, thus the name. And this was a rich man's crop. It was expensive to start, unlike tobacco, expensive to maintain. It was very labor intensive by 1700, and so they needed lots of slaves. And this is where slaves went in really a greater number than they did to North America in the beginning. By 1700, Africans outnumbered whites 4-to-1 on the Sugar Islands. Now, let me just talk a bit about that. Ask me about a book that you could read that will keep you awake at nights. Imagine what the white population of the Sugar Islands felt they needed to do to their slaves to keep them working and subservient. It was really a horrific way to die because that's what they went there to do, was to die. The average lifespan for a slave on the Sugar Islands was 4 years. So anyway, bring this up in class. We can talk more about it. Eventually, in these islands, the large plantation farmers pushed the smaller farmers out because they couldn't keep up to what is now called South Carolina. And the impact of this, one of the ways it impacted it is, if you look on page 38 in your book, there's a document there, and we're going to talk more about documents soon. It brought the Barbados slave system and the slave laws, and it was very harsh and cruel. And it's, South Carolina is going to be one of the strongest to defend slavery all the way up through the Civil War. They're the first to secede, leave the Union. And so they bring a real ugliness to how they treat slaves based on what they did in the Sugar Islands. So, differences, they all had some sort of, and I go really over these more down here in the plantation colonies. I just want to talk about these a little bit. North Carolina is kind of interesting. If you look on page 40, it is similar to Rhode Island. North Carolina, if you look on the map, was it's the poor people from South Carolina who couldn't cut it there. They move up to North Carolina, and the poor people from Virginia who move into North Carolina. So together, they kind of create a mountain people that's sort of Hatfields and McCoyish. They're very, they're not the plantation aristocrats, and they're going to hate those people. And they're just an interesting group. So they're a lot like Rhode Island. Okay, and so this is really, if we talk about the plantation colonies, and they're on page 41, what they all had in common, and that's those that are listed up there. Again, you're going to use this on that comparison. Your book writes they were broad acred, meaning you had tons of acreage on a plantation. And so if everybody did that, that meant they were all really spread out, and they're not going to develop towns and schools and real close together, or industry, things like that. So it's just going to be very different from New England and the North. An economy is based on staple profit crops: tobacco, cotton, rice, indigo, sugar. Little industry is going to develop because there's no need for it, because ultimately the North will produce what they need. They all had slaves and become very reliant upon it, especially with cotton. Immense acreage located in the hands of just a few people, and this creates an aristocracy, sort of a feudal system in the Americas. If you don't know what that is, bring it up. The plantations, like I said, were spread out, so far fewer towns and cities than in the North. Public education was not a priority at all compared to New England settlers. I have next chapter, but I think they're actually, yeah, next chapter we talk about that. At least some religious toleration, since they were not really built on spreading religion like in New England. Again, chapter 3. Something called soil butchery. These crops were really destructive to the land, and they constantly were moving inland. So they fought with Native Americans, and just a constant move westward because they destroyed the land. So that's really what they all had in common. I was just giving you some sort of free of charge stuff right up here. Okay, that is it for chapter 2.